This is one Sunday that I wish we had out on the street one of those signs like you see at many churches with the movable letters, so that I could put a sermon title out. And I think this week I might have been able to maybe attract a few more people in with a title something like this, Adolescent Erotic Love. I think that might have interested some folks and brought them in. Or maybe I could have taken a more literary approach and titled it Romeo and Juliet in the Bible. Or maybe another option would be a little more pop culture tag. I could have said The Beatles in the Bible. Because all three of those titles aptly describe the book that today's Old Testament lesson is taken from, the Song of Solomon. It is about adolescent erotic love, and you'll see that the language in it, if you read the Song of Solomon, is a bit risque. It has shades of Romeo and Juliet because even though this young man and woman are looking forward to their marriage, there's a sense that her brothers, her family, aren't quite too pleased with this suitor of hers. So a little bit of shades of the conflict of Romeo and Juliet. And the Beatles? Well, if you go a little bit further on in the Song of Solomon, you'll find this. If one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned. I'm sure you'll agree with me, that's probably the origin of money can't buy me love, don't you think? I'm pretty sure the Beatles were just paraphrasing the Song of Solomon. It is love poetry. And it's even dramatic love poetry because it's arranged in that the man speaks and the woman speaks, and then there's a kind of a chorus when their friends speak. And I even recommend to couples in part of our pre-marriage counseling that they might want to some night uncork a bottle of wine. Wine is mentioned throughout the Song of Solomon. And then take turns reading those parts to each other like a little dramatic play. The man taking the man's parts, the woman taking the woman's parts, and then the parts that are said by their friends spoken in unison. Might be great for any married couple to do that, to make a romantic evening out of the Song of Solomon. Now, you've probably never heard the Song of Solomon preached on before, because it was never in the Episcopal Eucharistic Lectionary that's in the back of the prayer book, the one that we used from the 1979 prayer book up until just a couple of years ago. It is in the Revised Common Lectionary, that's why it's one of this morning's readings, but this is the only reading from the Song of Solomon in that entire 3-year cycle. Now, it does get used quite often. It's one of the most common choices in wedding ceremonies. Beautiful to have that love poetry from the Bible read during a wedding. Well, it's interesting that wine is mentioned an awful lot in the Song of Solomon, but God doesn't get a single mention in it. There's no real religious content. And so we might rightly wonder, why is such a book even in the Bible? Well, prudish Jews say that it's really an allegory where everything is symbolic. Something stands for something else. It's really about God's love for Israel. And prudish Christians will say that it's really an allegory about Christ's love for the church. But I don't know. Read it and judge for yourself. I'm thinking if you want to have a spiritual or theological allegory, you don't really need to resort to terminology like breasts and thighs. That just doesn't seem to fit for me. It really is love poetry, pure and simple. So again, why is something like that even in the Bible? There is an ancient story, it may or may not be true, that when the rabbi scholars got together to try to decide which books would be included in the official Hebrew scriptures, that it was pretty sure that the Song of Solomon was not going to be included until an elderly rabbi came forward, and he said, the Holy Scriptures should be complete. They should be complete the way that God's creation is complete. They should be complete the way the human body is complete. And he said the Song of Solomon is like the reproductive organs of a human body. And if you don't put that in there, you have an incomplete body. You would have an incomplete Scripture. And apparently his argument carried the way with the other rabbis, and so we have the Song of Solomon in our Bible. Now, I believe that there's something else going on here also, and it has to do with the fact that we never take one piece of the Bible and read it by itself, totally apart from the rest of what's in the Bible. And that goes as much for a book of the Bible as it does for an individual verse or a small group of verses. People do this often, and it's a misuse of the Bible. If you pull an idea out without looking at how other places in the Bible deal with that same topic, you can come up with some kind of strange ideas when you start taking passages out of context and when you remove them from what is said about that same subject in other places. You always, for good Bible interpretation, need to take into account that kind of global understanding of what the Bible as a whole has to say, what God is saying to us in this whole Scripture, not just one tiny little piece cut apart. So this book of love poetry isn't read by itself, but it's read alongside all of the rest of what the Bible has to say about human love and what's right and what's wrong in human love. And also what the Bible has to say about God's love for us and our love for God. And so by putting this love poetry in the Bible, it really blesses it as a love poem. And it really does transform it and move it into another understanding. And so it ends up showing us that romantic love and attraction can be a very powerful way that God's purposes can be served. It reminds us that the bonds of love that are formed in couples can be the foundation for a life together lived in relationship with God. A life together lived in service to God and to other people in a way that perhaps neither of those individuals could live by themselves. And so it's the overall life of an individual or a couple's faith that blesses and transforms their romantic love and makes it a part of something bigger and more important. And I think that same kind of thinking process that lets us see that romantic love as part of our life has an even larger lesson to teach us. This love poetry doesn't mention God, but it functions within this whole witness of God, just like romantic love exists within a life that very much involves God too. And so in comparison, think about some aspects of your life that may seem at first glance to not explicitly involve God. There are oftentimes people have come to me and said, I go to work at the, fill in the blank, the bank, the grocery store, the insurance agency, the whatever, the law firm. That was for Lynn Allen. And I just don't see how God has anything to do with that. Well, that's always a wonderful introduction to talking about how God is involved in every aspect of our lives. But even if there are times and places, activities, and certain people where you just don't normally think about God being involved, maybe where you don't speak of God, maybe it's work, maybe it's where you shop, maybe it's in the hobby you pursue, or maybe there's certain people that are just, maybe they're not people of faith and you don't feel comfortable talking with them. It's okay that there are places in your life like that. I'm not saying you should ever avoid sharing your faith and letting people know what you believe, but there may be some places where it's pretty hard to do that. And yet, even if there are some places in your life where you haven't really yet realized that God is at work and active if the other parts of your life are well informed by God, by living out that relationship with God, by being actively aware of how you live out the will of God, then somehow all of our activities, everything we do in our lives gets blessed and gets transformed by that overarching presence of God in our lives. As long as that full context of our lives is lived in recognition of God, I think everything we do does serve God's purposes. And if we think and pray about it, I think we can begin to see, even in areas where we haven't really been able to figure out how God is involved, we can begin to see that God really is. Now, there's a verse that comes later on in the Song of Solomon, and I think it's one that can represent that kind of overarching representation of how our Christian life should involve God in all aspects. And I have changed the word. I've inserted God for him. It's a verse that the woman is talking about the man. But I'm going to read into it a bigger understanding of our relationship with God. This is what it says. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I will seek God, whom my soul loves. I will seek God, whom my soul loves. And maybe you recognize a little bit of overlap there in our baptismal covenant where we say we will seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving our neighbor as ourselves. I love this. Go out into the streets and in the squares, any place that we may go. As long as we keep in our minds this recognition that God is involved in our lives. If we do that, I believe that any and every part of our lives will be blessed, will be transformed, and there will never be anything that we do that isn't a part of God's plan.